Um, Welcome everyone to this evening's event. I am Scott Edgar. I'm the Assistant Arts and Cultural Programmer at Belfast Linen Hall Library. For those of you unfamiliar with the library, we're the oldest such institution in Belfast, and we're the only library in Ireland that still generates a proportion of our income from membership. If you enjoy this evening's event, please do visit our website where you registered for this event, and there you can find out more about how to become a member of the library. For now, I'm going to keep everyone placed on mute. If you have any questions or comments this evening, please type them into the chat box and we will get back to them at the end if time permits. So this evening's guest is Dr. Aaron Henson. Erin is based in Pennsylvania, United States of America. She spent 5 years in Belfast as she completed an MA and PhD degrees in history and anthropology at Queen's University. There, her research focused on the intersection of identity construction and change, the performativity of artworks and crafts, and prison experiences of Ulster Volunteer Force and Red Hat Commando political prisoners during the conflict. She also examined the re-emergence of prison-made handicrafts in post-ceasefire society and their use in multiple state and community-led projects and exhibitions. We will hear much more about this over the course of the evening. So for now, I will hand you over to Dr. Aaron Henson.
All right, thank you very much for that. You've pretty much gotten rid of one of my slides with that introduction, which is nice. But do I have the opportunity to share my screen?
Yep, yeah, that's fine.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Happy days. Make sure. Okay, can you see my slide? Yes.
Yes.
Yep, fantastic. Okay. So I will jump right in since I had this introduction. I believe in roadmaps for navigation, even through presentations. So this is the roadmap of where I'm going to go. I'm going to give a little bit about my research background, even though Scott already did most of that heavy lifting. And then I'll jump right into explaining what is heritage and why it's useful for those of us that are studying this type of material culture. I haven't actually trademarked the term Northern Ireland's Heritage Industrial Complex, but I might, and I'll explain a little bit more of that and get into various forms of heritage in Northern Ireland, what I am tentatively calling stakeholder driven and community driven, although I'm always open to suggestions. And then I like alliterations. So we'll have a preponderance of prison paraphernalia to go through and then get into some chunkier theoretical topics, history and identity and memory, and round out hopefully with some thoughts about telling the story of the Troubles, as if there's only one story. We all know there's way more than that. But that is where we were going. So let's crack on. My research background, I've been researching Northern Ireland since 2006, when I first took the history of Northern Ireland, history of the conflict class from my esteemed colleague and friend, Tony Novosel, who I know is on this chat today. So this is a picture of me actually speaking to Tony's class, which I've done since I took Tony's class in 2006. I got my MA and PhD in Irish Studies at Queen's in history and anthropology. So technically I'm a historical anthropologist, though I waver between being a historian or an anthropologist, depending on how I'm talking about my research. I continue to this day to teach and present and publish on elements of my research in the US, in Ireland, and in the UK. All right, what is heritage? This is a term that I wasn't really very familiar with when I started my PhD, but it became very quickly very useful in terms of understanding how and why different cultural groups engage in the past. And the definition that I used, that I still find the most effective, is from Graham, that heritage is a part of the past that we select for contemporary purposes. And those purposes can be economic, cultural, political. They often are all of those things at once. But it is this intentional selective process where we choose things, and by default, we don't choose other things that are aspects of the past in order to tell stories both about the present and the future. Therefore, his heritage is innately political because there are differing motivations, audiences, and goals depending on the group and what part of the past they are selecting. One of my least favorite phrases is we have to remove the politics from something, or we can't make this political. If you guys are here for this lecture, then you know everything is political because humans are political, but certainly heritage is. And it can be really useful when we're examining and critiquing narratives that come from curators and archivists, tour guides, participants, creators, and we can use heritage as that lens to examine these different goals and motivations and audiences. A lot of times it is applied directly in relation to museums or other physical spaces that can represent a group or a culture or a state. And there's, as there is with everything, an element of performativity in this, where curators and objects and visitors perform identities, meanings, and emotions through their display of the objects, the text that goes with them, the way that they organize tour guides, the way that individuals come and interact with those objects and bring their own personal biographies and politics and emotions to the table. And I like this quote that museums are always perform particular interpretations of reality and history, which they shape practices that construct and position social subjects. And what was so interesting for me when I was doing my PhD was that we often create a narrative that museums, especially national ones, are presenting the history of the nation. And we don't often consider this manipulation or this interpretation of the history as part of the, especially from a national level, the national myth making and the stories we tell about the origins of our nations or our states. There's not a lot of criticism aimed at the construction of these exhibits. And certainly that was a steep learning curve for me during my research, coming in as a historian, to learn to examine these different aspects through that lens. So we'll get into the Northern Ireland of it all. And these are just some pictures that I've taken over the last couple of years, the de facto field work conducted just visiting Belfast and experiencing what was taking place, and the ever-present references to Titanic, even the Victoria sponges at St. George's Market, the Game of Thrones of it all in terms of heritage tourism. And then that's one of my favorite billboards in all time. Below it, the Museum of Orange Heritage, then latching on to the Game of Thrones language to promote the Orange Heritage. So what's so interesting about Northern Ireland is, and in relation to this industrial complex of heritage, is that there are so many topics which emerge in these discourses and kind of compete for viability, compete for tourist money and promotion from the tourism board, and then compete for actual tourists. And what was often studied and talked about while I was there and continuing on now was the ready way that more official bodies were willing to promote Titanic related tourism, promote Game of Thrones and film industry related tourism, and not as ready or willing to put promotional material and tourism campaigns behind some of the more conflict related heritage projects. But as we all know, those are the ones that often bring a lot of people to Northern Ireland. So where I started this interest in heritage was so long ago, when we actually thought there might be something done with the Maze prison complex. Ironically, my entire PhD proposal was based on the proposed Peace Building and Conflict Resolution Center, which was so gloriously tanked by Peter Robinson a month before I moved to Belfast in 2013. So it required a bit of a tweaking in terms of my PhD proposal. But just a refresher course on kind of what happened with the maze and how it led to this growth of community-led heritage projects that we now see. So as we have a divided society in Northern Ireland living with this negotiated settlement, it means we then have to negotiate these divisive parts of and aspects of the history. The Maze and Long Cache prison complex that was at the time the compounds, even though they closed in 1988, and then the H blocks remained open until 2000. In 2004, we had the listing of several still remaining structures on the land and a part of the prison listed as historical landmarks, including the prison hospital and one compound, I think in one H block, and a number of other administrative buildings. From 2005 to 2010, we had a multi-sport arena that was proposed, a conflict transformation center, all sorts of these ideas for utilizing the space of the maze. And then in 2010, we got the announcement from the OFM, DFM that they were going to dedicate funds and time to the Peace Building and Conflict Resolution Center. And here you have on the slide pictures of First Minister and Deputy First Minister with the slogan, Maze Long Cache from Peace to Prosperity. And this was, you know, the launching of a massive heritage project from the perspective of the state of Northern Ireland. It secured a large amount of EU funding. And then by August of 2013, Peter Robinson went on vacation to Florida and wrote a letter speaking for his party, withdrawing their support for the proposed redevelopment of the maze. And what was so interesting about the letter that he wrote that was published in the Belfast Telegraph was that he wasn't opposed to the idea of a peace building and conflict resolution center. And he made that explicitly clear. What he was opposed to, or what he argued, was that the story of the maze didn't need to be a part of that peace building and conflict resolution center, which I just remember reading that thinking, where would you even get that idea? How would that work? How would we tell the story of the Troubles without talking about what happened at the prison and everything that came out of it, the politicians, the movements, the protests, and all of that. But it was really indicative, especially of, particularly at the time, unionist perspective on the maze redevelopment. And so perspectives on this a lot of times fell on sectarian lines. Martin McGuinness did not agree with his colleagues' withdrawal of support. Republicans tend to be, by and large, Republicans and Nationals, more supportive of redeveloping the maze. A lot of unionists and loyalists and working class Protestants would be less so supportive. And then you also had a number of victims groups and groups representing former prison officers that were opposed to developing the maze site. And that's because of these key factors of heritage that came into play with this specific site, which were the control of narratives and memory and space. And those are huge elements to understanding heritage as a concept, as a tool, and then looking specifically at how we've developed this industrial complex in Northern Ireland. I would not be an anthropologist if I did not include social construct in my talk. I am contractually obligated to do it. Heritage, as most things are, is a social construct. And in Northern Ireland, we have a variety of terms that we use to discuss the type of heritage that we can produce: contested, difficult, dissonant, Of the picture above the contested label, you'll see from some of the protests for the redevelopment of the maze. And it was this idea of who controlled the narratives about what happened in the prison and how those narratives would be represented that was the primary concern for developing, especially those historically listed sites. And I think we all know that had they developed particularly the prison hospital wing into some form of an exhibit, they would not have been able to control the visitors' performance of their identities within that space, and the concern that it would become a pilgrimage site for a lot of people who would sympathize and empathize with the Republican cause and with the hunger strikes was, I think, a reality, and something that a lot of unionist politicians knew that they weren't going to be able to control if they allowed that development to continue. So we get into this debate now with history of who owns the past and who gets to decide what past we tell and what stories we tell. For my thesis and for my work, I used the term contested heritage to talk about it. Graham defines dissonant or contested as the discordance or lack of agreement and consistency to the meaning of heritage. So that's fairly straightforward. I would also be remiss if I gave a presentation and did not reference the Hamilton the musical. So who tells your story is the next question that we get to ask with this. And in Northern Ireland, particularly, we get into, again, this tendency to reduce things to a zero-sum circumstance. And so he argues that dissonance arises because of the zero-sum characteristics of heritage, all of which belong to someone and logically, therefore, not to someone else. And so when we tend to have these contested heritages, they are viewed a lot of ways in this sense of ownership and legitimacy and claiming of a story and who gets to tell the story, who has the right to tell the story, what is the story trying to say not only about the historical past, but about the present circumstance in which the heritage is being constructed. So then we get to the part where we are now asking who gets to use the maze. And because heritage is a part of the past that is selected for the present, it is then also future oriented. Heritage is inherently contested because you're always going to have people and groups and cultures and states who want to tell a particular story. And so they select a version of the past in order to do so. And as we transform the Northern Irish conflict from violent to political, we created all of these new cultural biographies for objects that could then be utilized in these growing heritage projects. And this is a quote that I've used pretty much since it was written in the 2014 Northern Ireland Peace Monitoring Report. And one of the concluding arguments was that the war of the narratives has replaced the war of the weapons. Each side not only insists on the validity of its own narrative, but also insists on the lack of validity of any other narrative. And again, you see that similar zero-sum perspective on this. And once we got to a relative peace and stability, we all know the complications of that in the last 5 years since Brexit. But certainly once we reached a period of relatively functioning government around 2010, 2011, 2013, we start to see this shift in utilizing narratives and using heritage projects in order to enter into political discourses. So what do we get with the war of the narratives? We have this failure to agree on a shared language. Arguably, we can never agree on a shared language about the conflict, but then we are stuck in this intractable debate of dealing with the past. And the maze is really useful for kind of viewing the microcosm of contested histories and how they shape political discourse and policy about the conflict. And a lot of my friends and colleagues have done a lot of research about studying a post-conflict Belfast or the industry of peace building and what that looks like within the context of the current political discourses. And finally, we get to what happens when we have this void of an agreed upon or shared narrative. What happens when we don't have a strong state-led heritage response. We get a lot of community-driven and controlled heritage projects. And so now we'll get into the meat kind of that development. And this, I feel this quote is really useful for transitioning into this, although I would add an edit to it. I would offer an edit to it because, you know, Sarah Crane is arguing when war is the basis for collective memories, their multiplicity renders difficult any attempt to educate a public or recall a particular version of the past. I would offer the edit that when trauma is the basis for collective memories, or possibly when conflict, I think we can certainly expand it past that. And we only need to think about the collective trauma of experiencing a global pandemic now to know that we have a multiplicity of memories and experiences that's making it very difficult to talk about and to deal with the trauma of a global pandemic. So really when we, and you know, if we expand the conflict past the idea of a war or a conflict, we really are looking at a collective communal trauma that was experienced over a 25-year plus period. So the two forms of heritage that I've outlined, and again, I'm workshopping, as we say, these titles as a way to differentiate between two kind of ideas of heritage. And the first one is a stakeholder-driven perspective, which is more of a top-down approach. Neither of these concepts are black and white. There's elements of each within each other. But as I said, I'm trying to differentiate between these two different approaches. So again, I've broken them down along motivations, audiences, and goals. With a stakeholder-driven, more of a top-down perspective, the motivations a lot of times are guided by the needs and expectations of outside groups or investors. They tend to be more nationally minded and viewing the whole scope of the nation or the state. They might be more accountable to a broader public outside the specific location or community group. And then the goals a lot of times are measured in metrics like number of visitors, public relations, marketing, social media, and some broader and bigger projects. And then when we look at community-driven or community-led heritage, this is more of a bottom-up approach. And the motivations tend to be primarily focused on meeting the needs of the community or the group that is very specific to that location or that identity or that culture. The audiences tend to be usually first geared towards the local or specific audience or location. That doesn't mean that there's not then made a broader appeal to a wider audience outside of that community. And I'll get into some of those differences with community-driven heritage projects. And then the goals, they're often more about communicating a specific message. They might be a narrower scope or argument around a selected part of history or the past or heritage. Community engagement is often involved in it in some way. And sometimes the idea of providing legitimacy for a certain perspective can be a part, arguably, of both forms of heritage. So we'll dive through some examples of stakeholder-driven heritage projects in Northern Ireland and this is where we get to my favorite part, where I get to talk about prison handicrafts and how they're used throughout these different approaches to heritage. So first up, we have from the National Museum of Northern Ireland, the Ulster Museum, the Collecting the Troubles and Beyond exhibition. And this was something, there's been a lot of research done on this since my thesis in terms of the development of the new exhibition. The first Troubles Gallery opened in 2009, and oh my gosh, I spent probably half an hour over the weekend trying to find pictures that I had of the original exhibition, but apparently I didn't keep them, even though I know I visited many times. But if those of you don't remember it or didn't get a chance to see it while it was up, it was very small and very limited in scope. Everything was in black and white. Even if the photographs were originally taken in color, they were reduced to black and white. And throughout its tenure, it received a lot of criticism for how it addressed the conflict, what it did not address about the conflict, and what it didn't include. And so we see this development of a new project of collecting artifacts from the Ulster Museum called the Collecting the Troubles and Beyond project that led to, in consultation with historians at Queen's, a complete redo of this exhibition that now includes these stop and think little signs that talk about different intersections of the conflict, the representation of genders, and the kind of prompting you to think through some more theoretical questions. We've got prison-made handicrafts as visible in this slide, and a lot more artifacts. There weren't any artifacts present in the first exhibit, and so they've utilized them a lot more and broadened the scope. I mean, I know that's what they were going for with the Troubles and Beyond, is looking at Northern Irish society at the time beyond the scope of just what was happening with the conflict. So here we have more pictures and placards that go with this idea that the prison handicrafts are a part of telling this story, and they're a very effective communicative tool that is utilized in every heritage display that I am talking about today. And I'll get into some of the reasons for that. We also have from the Ulster Museum their utilization of dairy girls, which fair play. It's a wise tactical move to get people engaged in discussions about stereotypes of varying communities. And so we've seen from the Ulster Museum certainly a change in this approach from a stakeholder-driven heritage perspective that has engaged a lot more openly and broadly with narratives relating to the conflict than it had before. I also had an opportunity to visit and work in the Northern Ireland Political Collection at the Linen Hall Library. And I don't know if the display looks differently now, since I haven't been back to Northern Ireland in a couple of years now. But this is some photographs from my field work that show, again, the utilization of prison-made handicrafts. And there were certainly several items within the collection at the Linen Hall as well. The Crumlin Road Jail is another heritage project that's gone through kind of a rejuvenation and a reframing over the last couple of years. And they also have an exhibition in the basement that has prison-made handicrafts that are used to tell some of the story of what happened in the Crum. And so here we've got a couple of those displayed. Interestingly, the last time I took a tour of the Crumlin Road, they didn't spend a lot of time of the tour talking about the Troubles and those who were incarcerated there during the modern conflict. And that was always an interesting dichotomy for me, in that was probably a lot of the reason why people wanted to visit the Crumlin Road Jail. And for a long time, as a heritage project, they stayed away from the more emotional or complicated narratives that might be associated with the site, and talked a lot about the Victorian heritage. I know they've done and they've improved on that and expanded that in the intervening years, but it's always interesting to see what level of discussion people are willing to have or feel like they're able to have about the conflict and using conflict-related material culture. And this quote was from my thesis in an interview I did with William Blair, who's now the director of collections. And I asked him specifically about intentionally collecting prison-made handicrafts. And he said, in terms of the politics of identity, the prison material is very strong because it distills the politics of identity in very potent terms. And I think that's really useful for understanding why people find them so valuable in heritage displays and in museum displays, because they are a very pure distillation of a political identity. The cultural biographies of the objects are often much more complex than that. The biographies and the narratives of the people who made the objects are way more complex than the objects represent, but they are a very useful symbolic tool in that sense. On to community-driven heritage projects. I had the great honor to work very closely with the ACT initiative while I was doing my fieldwork and before and after. And so I was very much involved in the community-driven heritage project that was set up in the ACT offices. This picture behind this slide is from their old office space on the Shore Road, and they're now located on the Shankill Road in West Belfast and have a slightly different display. But we see, because of this void left from the lack of agreement or the lack of the use of the maze site, we see in the last 10 years, a lot of these heritage projects cropping up in different parts of Northern Ireland and representing different communities and cultures and groups. I cannot not mention Healing Through Remembering and the work that they did with conflict-related material culture. They started first with an audit in 2008 and the work that Chris Brown did for them, and then their everyday objects transformed by the conflict exhibition started traveling in 2012 as well. So these are all part of the patterns of people starting to have these discussions and move into these different heritage spaces. And Elizabeth Crook argues that one of the most important elements of community museums or local museums is that they can often provide an opportunity to give voice and authority to those who were formerly excluded from the narrative of the state. And while we have the inclusion of a lot of diverse narratives in the Now Collecting the Troubles and Beyond exhibit, this is very often the case in a lot of relationships between community museums and state-led museums or narratives of the state in a lot of ways. And so I think it still applies that these community-driven heritage projects in Northern Ireland still felt that it was important for them to represent their stories and to give voice and authority and physical space to the stories and narratives that they wanted to tell about the Troubles. So the name of the exhibit at the ACT initiative is Our Journey, Our Narrative. Again, there's that sense of ownership, even just in the title, that they wanted to take that initiative and create a display that told, broadly speaking, the story of the history of Northern Ireland, but also from a very specific lens of loyalist political prisoners and the influence of those political prisoners. So you can see in one of the photographs a placard that they have on with photographs of Plum Smith and David Irvine and Billy Hutchinson and Gusty Spence, who were all politically active after their incarceration and certainly involved in the signing of the Good Friday agreements and the ceasefires. So this, as I said, was originally based on the Shore Road and is now located on the Shankill Road in West Belfast. And this is from an interview I did with the founder of ACT, William Mitchell, who talked about his motivations for why he wanted to first build this heritage space to tell the story. And he told this longer story that there were a group of students, international students, that had come to visit Northern Ireland, to visit Belfast, and they'd gone to the Irish Republican History Museum the day before. And as he said here, I met them in the car park of the Shankill Leisure Center because we didn't have an office, we didn't have a space. And so we tell this story that's almost virtual because we had nothing physical that firms it up. And so that was part of the inspiration for him to create this physical space that helped support the telling of this story. And I know from William's perspective, that was always going to include artifacts and the engagement with visitors with those artifacts, and certainly prison-made handicrafts. So here you can see the utilization of the prison narratives and the prison handicrafts as a part of telling that story. And then we have a whole host of other heritage projects that I'll go through here. The Museum of Free Dairy, which reopened in 2018 after an extensive rebuild and a substantial portion of EU funding, but certainly the utilization of artifacts within that space, and even prison-made handicrafts, everybody, they're there, as a part of telling that particular story from the perspective of the creators of the Museum of Free Dairy. As I mentioned, we have the Irish Republican History Museum, which opened in 2007 in Conway Mills on the Falls Road in West Belfast. It has an exhaustive collection of prison handicrafts and material culture that is used to tell a very specific heritage relating to that community and to larger Republican narratives. We also have a place I have yet to visit, the Andy Thierry Interpretive Center, which opened in 2012 in East Belfast and deals with the heritage and history of the UDA. And then very recently in 2019, I got the opportunity to visit the Ballymac Friendship Center, where they have a historical display. It's very similar in terms of scope to the ACT initiative one, where it covers pretty much the 20th century and into the conflict, but they also have a very large collection of prison handicrafts, and even specific ones to that part of Belfast. So we have here leather handicrafts that's stamped with the Raven Social Club on it. So this is, again, that community-driven heritage. This, what community are we talking about here? We're certainly talking about a loyalist community, working class Protestant community. We're talking about specifically the UVF in this instance, but also East Belfast. And so there's all of these goals and aspirations of this heritage project are framed within that in a way that's different from the more stakeholder-driven projects. And then this is a quote from one of my research participants talking about their perspective on why the handicrafts and the artwork were valuable in terms of challenging the stereotypes, certainly within stereotypes around incarcerated loyalists. But this person references, Republican and loyalist, and that it's a part of the story that we tell and representative of the experiences that were in the prison. And so they become, again, that really useful tool for analysis and for symbolic representation. This is one of my favorite cartoons that I like to use when I give talks about this. And I think it's useful for illustrating the zero-sum argument, if you will, and the way that we use language to frame heritage and history and our understanding of it. So we could, input a lot of different phrases for Northern Ireland, but I think we can all make those conclusions on our own. So where does this leave us? Where do we go from here? In terms of history, I might regret quoting my dear friend Jonathan Evershed here, but he always told me during our PhDs that what actually happened doesn't matter. And as a historian, I kind of bristle with that, but I think when we're talking about heritage, he's right. That what actually happened is not necessarily as important as who tells the story, how the story is told, what parts of history are selected for the purpose of that storytelling. We've had brilliant scholars researching memory in Northern Ireland, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it is obviously a huge part of this discussion as well. And one of the things that I dealt with in my thesis was this idea that we view history through our past experiences, but also our present senses of self and our future aspirations. And so, you know, memories about anything are subjective and messy in very academic terms, but it's a huge part of this heritage as well, and both individual and collective memories and how those memories are shaped and how they are utilized in these political spaces is a huge part of this. Obviously, identity comes into this, how we see ourselves in relation to our history, our memories, and the objects that we choose to keep and display. If any of you can see what is behind me, I am a collector of objects, books and lots of other things, but they all say something about me, about my personal history and my experiences. And you know, this could arguably be a heritage space that I have created for myself. So that is always important to remember, that we're dealing with these intersections of history and memory and identity when we're selecting these objects. So the objects then become repositories for our histories and our memories and our identities. But they also serve, as we've seen, to reassert these elements in the present for future goals. And they're being used all over parts of Northern Ireland in places that are entirely public, semi-public, private spaces, to reassert these elements and to reassert an interpretation of heritage. So when we're telling the story of the Troubles, there are these three buckets that will be relevant for understanding and analyzing heritage projects as we go forward. Certainly, there's a huge element of education to this. It is the foundational element and idea of presenting information. As I said at the beginning of the talk, it's always important to remember that these are interpretations and perspectives and narratives of the past. But every one of the heritage projects that I talked about has a strong ethos of education and educating the public, both local and broader, to whatever portion of heritage they've selected. There's certainly a level of ownership to the memory and the identity, the objects, the story, the space. And a lot of times it can be about controlling the narrative and wanting to have control of that narrative and physical space and cultural and political symbols, and have some agency over how that story is told. There's also legitimacy in this as well, certainly from a lot of community-driven projects, but even from the stakeholder-driven ones as well. Heritage is inherently contested, and so the displays are really powerful physical manifestations of these dynamics and ongoing conflicts and discussions over who gets to tell what story and how. You know, I'd hate to get out of this without making more Hamilton references. So who tells your story? With no agreed upon, and arguably, is that even possible? I know a lot of people on this talk tonight would say it's not possible to have an agreed upon version of anything. Without an agreed upon story of the Troubles, heritage becomes this tool where we can analyze how people are asserting ownership and legitimacy over particular narratives, what their perspectives are of that heritage, and what their goals are, both for the present and for future ideas of heritage and politics and memory. Who gets to use the story of the prisons? We've seen through this talk a lot of different stakeholders and actors involved in utilizing prison-related material culture and prison narratives. Prison-related heritage has a huge economic potential. but we still are grappling with the remaining negative perceptions of the prison and those who were incarcerated there, in a lot of avenues where people, there are still a lot of people in Northern Ireland, from bottom up and top down, that would shy away from telling these stories, and would much rather talk about a ship that sank in 1912, or Game of Thrones as something that is quote unquote more palatable in terms of heritage and tourism development. And finally, what role do artifacts play? Hopefully after this talk, I've made a case that they play quite a big role. But Hoskins argues that artifacts are given significance by their placement within a human story. So they are meaningful because we give them meaning. They symbolize things because we associate them, we associate and attach meaning and memory and identity and stories to those objects. So they become a way for us to provide information, especially once we've displayed them in a public space. They create and perpetuate identities, both collective and individual, for the purpose of public consumption. And that's always, whenever I teach about this, that's something I always want to hammer home to my students, that these are for the purpose of public consumption. And so they know there is that element of performing for an audience and for people that are coming there to get that information, whether it's educationally driven, ownership driven, legitimacy driven. So they're necessary tools of communication in the politics of heritage. And we've certainly seen, especially the use of prison handicrafts in that heritage construction. And that is all I have. I wanted to make sure and leave some time for questions. If you would like to hear more, I have a couple of publications about some of this work, but I'm also happy to answer any questions.
A couple of questions and comments in the chat. I'm just taking a quick look through here. I don't know if you can see the comments there, Erin.
I can, yes.
Yeah, anything that you would like. We haven't really got any questions, but a lot of people in agreement with you, and sort of a lot of discussion about who those stakeholders are and who the storytellers are. One person has referenced there that it makes it difficult to see a shared future. Is that something that you would agree with, or not?
Oh, yes, I would certainly agree with that. It does make it difficult, I think, to see a shared future because, and a lot, I talk about Northern Ireland and I teach about it a lot. And this is probably one of the most common questions that I get. And Tony Novosel, myself, and a colleague of ours, Rachel Oppenheimer, were invited to speak before a screening of Kenneth Branagh's movie Belfast 2 weeks ago. And that was one of the questions we got from the audience was, what does this mean for Northern Ireland? What does this look like for Northern Ireland? And I think certainly heritage complicates any sort of attempt, but I don't think we should be aiming for a shared story of the past. I don't think that that's possible. I think we can find a way to have a better negotiated future than what we have had. And it certainly, I think, would need to start with accepting people's trauma. Again, I'm going to mention Tony. He's going to be tired of me mentioning him, but the greatest lesson I learned from him when I first started out in Northern Ireland is that understanding is not condoning. And so I think there's a lot more understanding that needs to happen in Northern Ireland for the trauma that people experienced, regardless of how they were involved or what happened to them. That's a really difficult thing for me to say. even as an outsider and as a cultural outsider. And so I know it's very, very difficult for people who are in Northern Ireland to hear and to believe and to work towards. But I do fundamentally believe that that's where we need to get. And if we get to a more shared understanding of where people are coming from and what motivates them, we can, maybe live in a less fractious version of Northern Ireland. Although, I mean, I'm living in a very fractious United States right now. So it depends on when you ask me what day and what has happened, how positive I feel about any of that.
I'm just picking up on your use of the phrase cultural outsider there. Obviously, not being from Northern Ireland or Ireland, what is it that first sort of interested or fascinated you about the situation here, and what led to you beginning this research?
Yeah. So I come from a very, I always say, stereotypical Irish American background. My name is Erin, which if you don't know is the anglicized version of the Irish word for Ireland. And my family had a very limited understanding of what happened in Northern Ireland and what the Troubles was about prior to taking the class I took at the University of Pittsburgh. And I was in this very room, which was my study room at the time. And I remember taking Peter Taylor's book, Loyalists, downstairs and just going to my mom, "Have you heard of Loyalists?" And she was like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, "There's a whole book. There's all these stories that we don't know." And for me, that was really what got me started and interested in Northern Ireland. And then I actually, Billy Hutchinson spoke to that same class a few years later and spoke about the prison handicrafts that were made. And I'm originally an art historian. That's what my undergraduate degree is in. So that got me very interested in the intersection of material culture and artwork with the story of particularly loyalism and loyalist prisoners.
Couple more people to get some questions in. One person has asked why, you may or may not know this, why the Ulster Museum's first Troubles exhibit was in black and white. Was it to make the event feel more distant?
I believe so. I mean, I can't speak officially on that, but that was certainly the general consensus, especially when we knew that photographs that were taken. I can remember in the original display, there was a picture of Bill Clinton from his visit in 1995, which we certainly would have had color film at the time. And it was an official like AP press photograph. So it most likely would have been taken in color. And it was presented in black and white. And yeah, I mean, I think, and if you look at the time when it first came out, 2009, I think it's understandable why you would create an exhibit that would give the sense that something was in the past and give the sense that there was perhaps more distance than there was between the events you were talking about and what was going on in Northern Ireland. I don't think it was necessarily helpful, but I certainly understand the reasoning behind it.
Another question here is, how do you place the political murals concerning the Troubles within the politics of heritage?
It's a great question. I can't believe I did a talk on artwork and crafts in Northern Ireland and didn't mention murals. They're very, that particular market in terms of academic research is very saturated. But there's been some great work done on them by colleagues at Queen's and by Bill Rolston and the like. I would certainly put them within the politics of heritage. Yes, they are a prime means of communication, both to communal insiders in terms of reinforcing aspects of heritage and history and narratives and storytelling, and also outsiders. and communal outsiders, especially now that we're in this period where we have the hop on, hop off tours of Belfast and all the bus tours that go up the falls and down the Shankill. And I was on many of those buses giving tour guides with Dominic Bryan to students that were visiting Queens. So they're exceptionally potent, and they're utilized as such by the communities. Only have to look at the evolving murals on the so-called international wall to know that they're used very, very much as a tool of communication, especially that wall for communal outsiders. I remember in 2016, they painted over almost every mural on the Falls Road side of that to depict a narrative story of the 1916 Rising, and it has since been repainted. So that's the fascinating thing with murals, is they're also evolving. One of the murals I showed on one of the slides is a recent UVF mural in East Belfast that depicts both original Ulster Volunteer Force, 36 Ulster Division soldiers, and the huts from the prison. So again, that historical continuity is really significant within murals. So yeah, they're a huge part of it. And they certainly, all of the things I said about prison handicrafts in terms of their political potency and symbolic potency, I would apply to murals as well.
A slightly different angle here. Someone has asked, did any of the security forces ever do arts or crafts, even post-Troubles, or would this have just been something for the prisoners or political prisoners?
From my knowledge, no, although that's very limited. I did some field work with the Northern Ireland Prison Service and their collection of prison paraphernalia, as I've labeled it. They had quite a substantial collection at the time of prison artifacts and prisoner-made handicrafts. I would imagine a lot of prison officers and staff members collected and kept handicrafts. To my knowledge, I don't know if any of them made them. That's an excellent question, actually. And if any of them are involved in them post-Troubles, I wouldn't know that either. It was very difficult at the time of my fieldwork to get information and access to the prison service and their records.
The murals from loyalist compounds are surely a big part of prison heritage, yet not on display. How could that be rectified?
Yes, that is another excellent question. And that was a huge part of my research, was attempting to locate and visually confirm that those murals still existed. I do have a large collection of photographs of what those murals looked like. I was able to speak with several of the muralists throughout my research. The last I heard through the grapevine, they were being stored in Maghaberry prison. The person I knew in the prison service has long since retired, and that well of information is something I know that has been continued to try and get access to. It's a huge part of their prison heritage, and if the prison service still has them and they're still viable, it's certainly something I would argue needs to be displayed, because it's a huge story of the loyalist prison experience and identity. And we love to talk about murals. So the last I heard, they still existed, but that was 5 or 6 years ago, so I have no idea the accuracy of that.
And talking of displays, we have a message from Roberta Batchik, who would like to draw everyone's attention to the conflict textiles on display as part of the Troubles and Beyond at the Ulster Museum. So we'll just give that a mention. I would also like to add to that the displays at the Linen Hall Library have changed considerably, but we do rotate things quite often, and we will next year be having a lot more kind of Troubles related material as part of various exhibitions. People are still welcome to come in and explore the Northern Ireland Political Collection. And we will actually be having an event in December, so you can check out the website for that, where Dr. Chris Brown and Dr. Gordon Gillespie will be talking through the Northern Ireland political collection. And that's my plug for the evening. So I don't think we've got any other questions. If maybe have time to take one more quick one, if anyone has got any burning issues there. But someone's saying there the latest is that the Ulster Museum have the murals. So that's perhaps something to look into.
Oh, that is news to me. But thanks, Ron, for sharing that. So hopefully that means that then they will be utilized. I know the kind of the problem with this is, where do you stop, right? How do you keep all of these interested groups happy with displaying things and talking about things? How much do we talk about the Troubles? How much do we talk about life that existed? I mean, everything was related to the Troubles as it was happening, but there was a lot of life that was lived that wasn't directly conflict related. And I mean, that's why they have the and beyond at the Ulster Museum and when I spoke to William Blair about it, they were very conscious of collecting artifacts and stories that were about pop music in the 1970s and, you know, the gay rights movement and women's feminist movements and all of that stuff that was also happening. So I think it's, you know, there's never unlimited space. And that's another thing that any stakeholder, you know, top down or bottom up has to deal with, is the availability of space for displaying any sort of artifacts. And so hopefully the Ulster Museum, if they can, will make it at least digitally accessible so that we can access that part of it. But it's always hard to draw that line.
Erin, I would just like to thank you very much for joining us this evening. I think this has been really interesting. Everyone seems to have enjoyed it and taken great things away from this. I would like to thank everyone else as well who registered and came along. We couldn't run these events without your support, so I would extend an invite to you to visit lindenhall.com. There you can view our upcoming program of events, including that one with Chris Brown and Gordon Gillespie in December. You can also head over to our YouTube channel, see some past events, including a great one with Billy Hutchison, who was mentioned a couple of times this evening. You can find out more about becoming a member of the library and do lots of other stuff. But for now, I would just say enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.